On the morning of June 18th, 2004, a motorist driving down a rural road in Burnet County, Texas, saw something strange. It was a large light source up ahead that appeared to be coming from off of the actual road, one that couldn't help but catch the driver's eye in the pre-dawn darkness. Though initially unsure, after drawing closer, the driver realized to their alarm what they were actually seeing. It was a crashed vehicle at the bottom of a ravine, and it was completely engulfed in flames. While it's unclear what the motorist was thinking as they dialed 911 that June morning, it's safe to say that they had no idea what they had just unearthed. What they didn't know, rather, what they couldn't have known, is that this was no ordinary traffic accident. In actuality, the whole thing was part of a twisted plot that had been in the works for months. And as investigators would soon learn, this was only the beginning. Before we get to today's story, if you find our content interesting and informative and haven't already, we'd be honored if you'd take a second to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell. It helps you to keep up to date with our latest releases, and helps us to keep up with that pesky ever-changing YouTube algorithm. With that out of the way, let's get to the video. When firefighters and police officers arrived at the scene of the fiery car wreck that morning, one of the first things that stood out to them was how extensive the damage was. Several noted that they had never seen a vehicle burn this badly after a crash, to the point that almost everything apart from the car's frame had been reduced to ashes by the time the flames were extinguished. The tires were completely gone, and substantial chunks of the aluminum alloy wheels had even melted into surrounding rocks. As perplexing as the vehicle's exterior was, though, it was nothing compared to what emergency responders would find when they looked a little closer. Inside the burned-out wreckage of the car was a human body, or perhaps more accurately, the remains of one. It appeared that the fire had raged so intensely that almost everything recognizable had been consumed. Disturbingly, sources say that what was actually left of the remains only weighed about 12 pounds. All of that being said, there were a few identifiable things that had been spared by the blaze that police were able to collect. A couple small scraps of clothing, the partially melted sole of a tennis shoe, and two small pieces of jewelry, which consisted of a wearable pin and a silver necklace. After examining the vehicle itself, authorities were able to determine that it was a green 1999 Chevy Cavalier. Its registration revealed that it belonged to a young married couple named Clayton and Molly Daniels. They lived in Leander, a city located near the northern outskirts of the Austin metropolitan area, and about a half-hour's drive from the crash scene. And, as it happened, Clayton was missing. By the time police showed up at the Daniels' Deer Creek Lane home, Molly was already searching for her husband. She had called family members earlier that morning in a panic, saying that she didn't know where Clayton was. He had gone to visit his mother's the previous night, but had never returned. This was extremely concerning because Clayton knew that Molly needed their vehicle to get to her receptionist job that morning, and he was supposed to be the one looking after their 4-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter while she was at work. Officers shared the grim details of what they had discovered that morning. The couple's Chevy Cavalier had been destroyed in a devastating fire, and human remains had been found inside. They explained that based on what they had found so far, they had reason to believe that this was the body of Molly's husband, Clayton. The remains had been sent for an autopsy in neighboring Travis County, where the deputy medical examiner had concluded they belonged to a man. Samples had been sent off for DNA testing, but in the meantime, investigators showed Molly some of the few items that had survived the crash. Sadly, she was able to confirm that the silver necklace was Clayton's, as well as the wearable pin. She recognized it as the Harley-Davidson pin he always wore on his baseball cap. The portion of melted tennis shoe and the couple scraps of clothing also matched a description of what Molly believed Clayton had been wearing when he left the house the evening before the crash. Following the devastating revelation, a funeral was held for Clayton Daniels in his hometown of Burnet. Sources state that the service was true to the 23-year-old's style. Instead of the regular church hymns, the Leonard Skinner song "Freebird" was the music of choice. A dirt bike featured prominently on the stage next to pictures of Clayton. As a mechanic, he had taken an interest in all sorts of vehicles, but more than anything, he had loved motorcycles, especially the iconic brand Harley-Davidson. Neighbors recalled that while the Daniels family mostly kept to themselves, you could count on Clayton to be out on the driveway most afternoons tinkering with some sort of vehicle. Though the 23-year-old being gone was a tragic enough idea for friends and family to come to grips with, thoughts also soon turned to the family he had left behind. At 21 years old, Molly was now a widow with 2 young children and a mortgage to pay, all on her own. Realizing her dire situation, the community rallied around Molly. Coworkers raised $1,000 to help her pay her bills. Friends and family members offered support in whatever way they could, and even total strangers jumped in to lend a hand. This included a woman named Jenna who lived in Molly and Clayton's neighborhood. Despite never meeting the couple before, after seeing a flyer that had been posted saying that Molly needed help, she offered to look after her son and daughter while she was at work. At the same time that this heartwarming public response was occurring, though, things were taking on a darker tone for authorities. You see, as they had continued their investigation to try and explain what had caused the tragic accident, they started to encounter more and more things that didn't add up. In fact, they were beginning to suspect that what had happened that June morning hadn't been an accident at all. As investigators combed through evidence at the scene of the car wreck, they started to notice details that were inconsistent with a simple crash. For starters, there were no skid marks on the pavement leading up to where the vehicle had gone off the road, meaning that the driver either hadn't had time to stop or simply hadn't tried. This suspicious discovery was compounded by the strange damage to the car itself. While the vehicle had been ravaged by the fire, it was noticeably lacking the kind of denting or crumpling to its frame that would have been expected from a serious crash or impact. When investigators took a look at where the car had gone off the road, something else caught their attention. There was a clear path of disturbed rocks and greenery, which could be followed all the way down the ravine to where the vehicle had been found. This was strange because the speed limit on the road was 60 miles per hour. The evidence, however, seemed to suggest that the car had gone down the slope at a much slower speed, never leaving contact with the ground. It appeared that either someone had driven it down there slowly, or it had been pushed. Then, there was the fire itself. As previously mentioned, one of the first things that emergency responders had noticed upon arriving at the scene was how intensely the vehicle burned. When arson investigator Janine Mather was brought in to look at the scene, she confirmed that authorities had been right to wonder about this. After examining the car, Mather was able to rule out all accidental causes of ignition. The fuel lines, the ignition switch, the starter, and the battery were all cleared, and even the vehicle's gas tank was intact. When debris from the scene was further analyzed at the crime lab, the source of the fire was finally revealed. It had been started with large amounts of charcoal lighter fluid. With this discovery, the entire situation changed. Authorities were now dealing with a murder investigation. With detectives now believing that Clayton Daniels had been the victim of a homicide, they moved their focus to the obvious question: who would have wanted the 23-year-old dead? It didn't take long for authorities to find out that Clayton had plenty of enemies. For starters, a number of Molly's friends and family members weren't fans of her and Clayton's relationship. He was frequently out of work and had a habit of getting into unnecessary fights with little to no provocation. A co-worker of Molly's recalled how one night she had treated the couple to a night out, even agreeing to babysit their kids while they went on their date. However, the whole thing almost hadn't happened because when they dropped off the children, Clayton got into an argument with the co-worker's upstairs neighbors. When asked, a bunch of people in Molly's life had said that they always thought she could do better relationship-wise. This was just the tip of the iceberg, however. As it turned out, the 23-year-old had an incredibly chilling secret that not many people knew about. Back when he was 16, Clayton had sexually assaulted his 7-year-old cousin. The crime hadn't come to light until several years later, in May of 2002, at which point he had been indicted on multiple charges. However, much to the horror of the victim's family, Clayton got away with a 10-year deferred adjudication. Essentially, this is a form of plea deal where a defendant agrees to plead guilty or no contest to a charge in exchange for fulfilling requirements laid out by the court. As long as the person complies with the probation terms under the agreement, they stay out of jail and at the end may avoid a formal conviction on their record or even have their case dismissed entirely. Needless to say, this was seen as a slap in the face by the victim and her family. Police learned that things had actually gotten even more contentious, though. You see, Clayton had not complied with the terms of the plea agreement and hadn't bothered to meet with his probation officer. When he had been taken back to court over this, he had only been punished with a 30-day jail sentence. Once again, the victim of the assault and her family were furious, particularly her father, who detectives learned had made comments that he wanted Clayton to, quote, go away. This had all taken place in the run-up to the June car wreck. In fact, Clayton was due to start the 30-day jail sentence just 3 days before the fire. As interesting as these leads were, however, as authorities continued to ask around about Clayton Daniels, they started to learn that public opinion was turning on his widow, Molly. It seemed that she might now be hiding a few secrets of her own. When authorities reached out to friends and family members of Molly Daniels, they began to receive information that intrigued them. Multiple people said that she had been acting suspiciously ever since Clayton's death. In particular, she didn't appear to be grieving. Of course, everyone who had supported Molly wanted her and the kids to be okay, but the way that she had bounced back had surprised even those that weren't fond of her late husband. There were rumors that just a month after Clayton was gone, Molly had started dating again. Neighbors in the area said that they had seen a dark-haired man at Molly's house quite a few times, and coworkers had also seen her get dropped off at her job a couple of times by someone in a car they didn't recognize. When Molly was confronted about this by those that knew her, she acted even more strangely. At first, she denied the whole thing completely, before telling a couple of people that the man was just a family friend. However, Molly's new babysitter, Jenna, couldn't be fooled. Because she took care of her children, she had a more intimate window into Molly's personal life, and she could definitely tell that something was up. Jenna first became suspicious when Molly's 4-year-old son started talking non-stop about his mom's new friend, Jake. Her suspicions were confirmed when one morning Molly's car needed a jump start, and Jake came outside to help in nothing but his boxer shorts. Clearly, he and Molly were more than just friends. Eventually, Molly admitted the relationship to multiple people. Yes, she was seeing someone new. His name was Jacob Gregg. Even so, she was cagey about where she met Jake. Given the timing, some wondered if she had actually been seeing him before Clayton had died. This was interesting because of another thing that investigators had learned about Molly Daniels. She was the beneficiary of a $110,000 life insurance policy that had been taken out on Clayton. Detectives were beginning to believe that Molly might have plotted her husband's murder. She was placed under surveillance to see if they could learn more. However, just when it seemed like authorities had everything figured out, the case would take a shocking turn. As previously mentioned, though there wasn't much left of the remains found at the June 2004 crime scene, a sample had been sent off for DNA testing. This had actually been done by a sergeant from the Texas Rangers named Garth Davis, who had been brought in to assist with the case early on, and who immediately felt something was off. In particular, Davis was skeptical of the autopsy work that had been done by the medical examiners in Travis County. At the behest of Davis, a sample was taken from the hip bone of the remains and sent off for DNA analysis, to be tested against a sample provided by Clayton Daniels' mother. 5 months later, in November of 2004, those results came back. It turned out that the samples were not a match. As authorities grappled with this stunning revelation, the surveillance on Molly Daniels continued. That was until December 3rd, when they decided to follow her and her new boyfriend into a Taco Bell where they were having lunch. As soon as police laid eyes on them, they knew why the DNA at the crime scene had not been a match. Though he had grown out his hair and dyed it black, it was clear that Jacob Gregg and Clayton Daniels were the same person. He and Molly were arrested on the spot. While the couple both initially refused to speak after being taken into custody, it reportedly didn't take long for Clayton to give away most of the relevant information to a jailhouse informant. When detectives confronted him with what he had said, he finally confessed to everything. Clayton explained that when he was sentenced to the 30 days in jail for violating his probation, he knew that he was going to be put on the registry for the heinous crime that he had committed against his cousin years earlier. He and Molly feared that this meant that their lives would fall apart. He wouldn't be allowed to see his children anymore, and they would have to move because they lived close to a school. So, they devised a plan to fake his death. Molly had been the brains of the operation. For months, she had meticulously researched everything from how to destroy forensic evidence with fire, to what temperature different materials burned at. The couple knew that they needed a body to stand in for Clayton's, and here too, Molly had done her research. She learned that they needed to use remains that were recent enough that they would be affected by the fire properly, but not so recent that they risked leaving behind extra evidence. Disturbingly, Clayton and Molly had checked obituaries and deaths in the surrounding area until they came across Charlotte Davis. Charlotte was an 81-year-old disabled woman who had passed away in December of 2003, about 6 months before the crime. The pair further selected Charlotte because they figured she wouldn't have many friends or family members, and she was buried in a cemetery that was in a rural area where they figured fewer people would notice if a grave was disturbed. On the night of June 17th, they had driven out to this location, the Pebble Mound Cemetery in Burnet County, and had dug up Charlotte's body. They had then driven a few miles away and pushed their Chevy Cavalier down into the ravine with the remains inside, before dousing everything with lighter fluid and setting it on fire. A few of Clayton's personal items had been thrown in to give investigators something to identify. After this, Clayton had gone on to assume the identity of Jacob Gregg, thanks to documents Molly had managed to acquire. She was able to get him a Texas state ID, obtain phony state records, credit reports, and even school transcripts. The plan had eventually been to move. However, the life insurance money had never cleared. Once Sergeant Davis from the Texas Rangers had gotten suspicious, the insurance company refused to release the money until the results of the DNA test came back. When detectives confronted Molly with what Clayton had told them, she confessed as well. She claimed that she had done it all for her husband and kids, and that she feared Clayton's legal trouble would force their family to split up. She said that she had used what she learned from TV shows like CSI and Law & Order to try and plan the crime. Evidence found in Clayton and Molly's home backed up everything they said. 2 bottles of charcoal lighter fluid were found hidden away in a kitchen cupboard, and records for Clayton's fake Jacob Gregg alias were scattered throughout the house. Thanks to a virus on Molly's computer, police were able to obtain incredibly detailed records of her activity on the device, in addition to her online search history for the previous few months. In addition to confirming all the meticulous planning that had gone into the horrible crime, the information also revealed new evidence. It seemed that once the insurance money came in, Molly and Clayton had been planning on moving the family to Mexico. They had even gone so far as to look into multiple plastic surgeons there, likely with the goal of making Clayton less recognizable. Though, according to some sources we came across, the pair had also looked into tummy tucks, so perhaps they were mixing business with pleasure. In either case, it seemed obvious that the Danielses were planning to start a new life. When the case went to trial in spring of 2005, Clayton and Molly once again claimed in court that everything they had done was to protect their family. However, not many people were sympathetic, perhaps least of all those who had supported Molly for months when they believed that she was a widow. Among those who were particularly disgusted was Molly's neighbor and babysitter, Jenna. She would later reveal in interviews with media how she observed the negative psychological impacts the scheme had on Clayton and Molly's children, particularly on their 4-year-old son. The boy had been told his father was dead, only for a new man who looked exactly like him to come into his house and start claiming that he was someone else. During this time, Jenna claimed that the 4-year-old boy's behavior had become increasingly more erratic. It's not hard to imagine why. Clearly, he was having a difficult time understanding what was going on at home. Ultimately, Molly was convicted of insurance fraud and hindering apprehension and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. A couple of sources we came across say that she ended up serving 12 and was released sometime in 2016. Clayton, meanwhile, was convicted of insurance fraud, arson, and desecration of a cemetery, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, plus a further 20 years for probation violation in connection with the crime against his cousin. According to the most up-to-date information we could find, he is still incarcerated. Though this is where most sources we found about the case left off, we just didn't feel it was right ending without taking at least a couple of moments to talk about Charlotte Davis, the woman whose grave was cruelly desecrated in the service of this awful scheme. As it turns out, one of the many things that Clayton and Molly were wrong about was that no one would notice or care about what happened to her final resting place. True, Charlotte only had one living relative at the time of her death, but according to those that knew her, she was a wonderful person who did have people that cared about her. Jean Worrell, whose family served as caretakers of the cemetery where Charlotte was buried, and who also helped to look after her in her later years, described her as a sweetheart. She said that despite being confined to a wheelchair for most of her life due to birth defects, Charlotte was an inspiration to everyone she met and touched many lives. These words were echoed by another of the elderly woman's caretakers, Laura Lovelace, who also chose the special dress that Charlotte was buried in. Though Charlotte's remains were returned to her burial plot at the Pebble Mound Cemetery, those that knew her were still haunted by what had happened. In an interview at the time that this whole story unfolded, Jean Worrell lamented that the cemetery would never again feel like a true resting place. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.